Welcome to Our State of Education, a monthly conversation here on 760 WJR, where we explore the future of Michigan's K-12 schools. I'm Lloyd Jackson. I'm joined by my co-host, Angelique Power, President and CEO of the Skillman Foundation. Angelique, what's on tap for today?
Hi, Lloyd. Well, today's episode is called Reporting Live from the Field, and we're going to the front lines to talk to journalists covering K-12 education. These folks live in and report on what's happening in our communities daily. They bring us breaking news and longer, deeper analysis of issues, helping us all understand what's happening and why it matters. This is a critical time for education in Michigan, so today we're turning the tables and interviewing the interviewers. Tune in for their real take on it all.
Can't wait to get into the show because when we talk about education, we're really talking about the future of our state, its economy, equality, and the well-being of every child. So whether you're in Detroit or the UP, a parent or a policymaker, this conversation is for you. This is Our State of Education on 760 WJR. Welcome back to Our State of Education here on 760 WJR, brought to you by the Skillman Foundation, which invests over $20 million each year to strengthen education for students in Detroit and across Michigan. Now, to guide us into today's conversation, here's your host, Skillman President and CEO, Angelique Power.
Thanks, Lloyd. Today's show brings us behind the news desk and into real conversation with education reporters doing tireless work around the clock. As you all know, we talk to all kinds of folks on this show. We talk to young people and teachers, administrators, business leaders, policymakers, and family members. And there's another piece that's essential to a healthy education ecosystem, and that's trusted local journalism. At the Skillman Foundation, we believe communities are stronger when people have access to clear and accurate information. We love local news like WJR, run by locals themselves who know our communities best. And that's also why we provide grant funding to several local nonprofit newsrooms, including Chalkbeat Detroit, Bridge Michigan, Bridge Detroit, Outlier Media, Detroit Public Television, WDET, and Michigan Radio. These nonprofit newsrooms are doing critical work on every topic, but especially on what's happening in education across Michigan. They help explain complex systems and policies in plain language. They hold those in power accountable to the people. And just as importantly, they uplift the stories of students and families, educators, and communities, helping us better understand one another and stay connected. Education reporting is not just about test scores or budgets. It's about what our students are experiencing and how this helps or maybe hinders them, and what can be done to better support them. It's about whose perspectives are being heard as opinions are being shaped, and how decisions made at the policy level show up in real classrooms and real lives. So today, we are joined by journalists who are reporting from the front lines every day. We have Lori Higgins from Chalkbeat. We have Isabel Lohman from Bridge, Michigan. And we have Sascha Raiyn from WDET. These journalists hit the streets with a mic and a pen, and today we're going to have them help us understand what are the big news stories to watch for in 2026. So welcome, ladies. I'm going to just go down the line and ask for like 1 to 2 words. How does it feel to have the mic turned on you? Do you want to start us off?
It's always weird. It's always weird to be on the other side of the interview, but I think it's also important. It's important to flex that bone and be accountable to the community in that way, I think.
Thanks, Sascha.
Yeah, I'd say it's a little intimidating, but also exciting.
Thanks, Isabel.
Same here. Challenging, but it's something that we do.
All right, well, I'm going to ask the hard-hitting questions. Let's dive in. Most of the conversation we're going to be talking about education, but you all are working in this field of journalism which has changed so much, and I can't think of a time where it's more important, and yet journalists are often sort of under attack themselves. So I want to go back to why you chose this field and ask you, why did you decide to become a reporter, and why education reporting? Do you want to start us off, Sascha?
I always knew I wanted to be a journalist. I was always a writer. I was always really curious. I always wanted to be in a position to experience more of the world. And so I aimed at journalism from a really, really young age. Education journalism was something I was invited to do, and I won't pretend that I knew what I was getting into. So it's a really important and challenging space. The stakes are really, really high. So I think once you get into it, just the weight and the responsibility are really consuming.
And we're going to come back to those high stakes. What would you say, Isabel?
Yeah, I'd agree with the high stakes component of it. I sort of fell into education reporting, but I was around journalism all my life. My parents were those rare parents who said you have to watch the nightly news every night, which is not a fun way to spend elementary and middle school evenings, but it was just kind of always around me. And then I went to college thinking I wanted to do journalism, but wasn't 100% sure of it. And then once I was like actually out in the field, it just like called to me. And to your point, the stakes are high. When you're in those classrooms, you're seeing what's happening, and you want to be able to share that with other people.
Do you still watch nightly news?
I don't watch the news every night, but I'm still like consuming a ton of news. I don't have a TV, so that's part of it.
Okay. Lori?
So I got into journalism kind of by accident. I thought I wanted to be an accountant, even though I was terrible at math. And that was crystal clear in my first year of college when I ended up in remedial math. But I had a roommate who was a journalism major, and so I was really inspired by her going to random meetings, and I would tag along with her, and I just thought it was really just fascinating that, we could tell readers what was happening in our communities, and they would care. I have been an education journalist since 1992.
Wow.
For a very long time. I come from a family of educators. My mother was a teacher. Her sisters were teachers. A lot of our immediate family were teachers. But I'm really passionate about education journalism, particularly in Detroit, because of my own experience growing up in Chicago and attending inner city schools and going to college and realizing that I wasn't completely prepared for life after high school. And I noticed the same things happening with kids today. And so what drives me is like wanting to answer the question, like, why can't we ensure that kids who look like me, who come from the same backgrounds that I came from, are able to succeed in school and go on to college and not feel like a failure. So I do think that I see myself in some Detroit kids who experience the same things that I have.
Let's stay there, and let's stay with you. So you, at the top of the year, you published a story about education issues to watch in 2026. And to give some context, you talked about how Michigan is lagging behind some of the other states in terms of student outcomes or even improvement in some of those education outcomes. We have new leadership here in Detroit. We have Mayor Mary Sheffield. We have a new state superintendent. And next November, we will elect a new governor. So can you talk to us about where you sit as a reporter? What are these sort of key K through 12 education issues that are possible to be addressed with the change in leadership?
I think we're at a really critical time right now. Michigan students are not doing okay. And we haven't really found, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of blame going around, but no real answers to how we can address this. And I do think that this is a year where I think us as journalists can spur that discussion. I think that a lot of the fixes for what's ailing schools is geared toward punishment or geared toward choice, geared toward things that don't address the real challenges that are happening in our schools. And I'm going to turn your question around and say what I would hope the discussion is this year is looking more at why are kids struggling, and figuring out how do we address the systemic issues that make it difficult for some kids to learn. Kids are struggling in Detroit, but they're struggling all over the state. And I think all kids want to learn. I think all teachers want to teach. And I think that there are some issues that we really haven't gotten at that need to be addressed, such as poverty, such as chronic absenteeism. These are things that schools can't solve these things by themselves. And without leadership at the state level, at the city level, we're going to continue to see the kind of performance that we're seeing from young kids.
We're going to come back after the break and talk a little bit more about those challenges that we're seeing. Lloyd, back to you.
Well, that's where we'll leave it for this segment of Our State of Education. It's powered by the Skillman Foundation, investing in brighter futures for Detroit's youth and students across Michigan. We'll continue with more from Lori and from Isabel and also from Sascha next on 760 WJR. Welcome back to Our State of Education, brought to you by the Skillman Foundation, which believes student, parent, and teacher voices must be at the table when decisions are being made about our schools. We're back with our guests, Lori Higgins from Chalkbeat Detroit, Isabel Lohman from Bridge, Michigan, and Sascha Raiyn from WDET. Once again, here's your host, Angelique Power.
Thanks, Lloyd. Sascha, let's pick up where we left off. What are some of the challenges or gaps that you see that are creating these issues in our system?
When we think about education in Detroit in particular, it is easy to see that the level of poverty is at the center of a lot of the experiences that children are having in school and out of school. But it's really hard, I think, to tell stories that show the kind of comprehensive, consuming nature of poverty and position people at every level to talk about their experiences and think about what kinds of comprehensive consuming policies might be needed to address those kinds of experiences. So certainly we are not that far from the COVID pandemic, and we're seeing the skill gaps in the kids who were okay and the kids who were not okay, academic, social, emotional gaps are still really persistent. The other thing I think about that I hope can impact how we talk about education is just hearing more from students and parents and community members about their experiences, their needs, their goals, and their values, and having just a broader conversation about what people need, what they want, what they're experiencing, so that hopefully people can be more on the same page at every level and as we try to move forward.
Yeah. Yep, we believe that at Skillman, absolutely, that is a missing piece at the policy table. And that's what you all do, is you help to lift those voices so they can be heard. Isabel, let's talk about bright spots. I think sometimes we do focus on the issues because it is important to do that. But what are you seeing when you travel Michigan? Like, what are some of the bright spots happening?
Yeah, there absolutely are bright spots. I'm in schools a lot, and one thing that I see is teachers, for example, really digging deep and trying to figure out the best way to teach kids how to read. And it's not you just pick up a book and you're like, okay, now I know how to teach the kids. Now I do it. Like, it's a lot of tactile work. It takes a long time to figure it out. So I see some of that effort from teachers, and teachers are working hard every single day. I think you mentioned student voice. I think that's something that we're hearing from the Michigan Department of Education that they want to lift up. So I think that's an interesting angle. What are students saying they need from their schools right now? And then I think you see some interesting data coming out about pre-K enrollment. I know we primarily focus on K-12 on this show, but pre-K enrollment and those early skills that students are developing, we may eventually see that kind of playing out in those test scores and those later grades. It's going to be a while till we see that, but I think it's interesting to see the kind of state emphasis that's being put on those early grades.
I want to talk about the Mississippi, and I'm doing air quotes, miracle. And so we've heard a lot about this. We actually brought the former state superintendent from Mississippi to, now in Maryland, to Michigan in December. She spoke to the business leaders of Michigan and sort of spent time with others in the governor's office. The New York Times recently just wrote about Mississippi. So, I put air quotes around miracle because the state superintendent herself, Dr. Carrie Wright, would say it wasn't a miracle, it was a marathon, and it happened over a long period of time. What did Mississippi get right that we should be doing in Michigan, and what should we do differently here? And this is for anyone.
I mean, I visited Mississippi this past summer, to look at what they've done. They've done a lot of different things. I'll go through all of them, and then we can talk about what Michigan can and can't do, maybe, or what we should or shouldn't do. But, they train teachers on what's called the science of reading. It's about, how does the brain learn to read? They passed a law that holds third graders back if they're testing way below proficiency. That is controversial there. It's controversial in Michigan when we had it too. They changed their state standards. They've done a bunch of other things, including like emphasizing top literacy curriculum. So that's some of the stuff that we're doing, and I'm sure they both have ideas about like what we can do from there. But I think one thing that's really important to remember is they did a whole bunch of different things, and there was sort of a cohesive plan with it. And if Michigan just takes one part of Mississippi's policy off the shelf and tries to implement it, I don't think we're going to see the type of growth we all want to see.
Thanks, Isabel. Anyone else?
I think one thing that I think about is Michigan has tried a lot of different reforms over the years and has abandoned a lot of them. And I think what Michigan and other states that are trying to improve need is sustained work. They need to be able to see some of these things through. And I think sometimes in Michigan, politics gets in the way of actually seeing whether or not some of these controversial things like holding third graders back actually work. Holding third graders back, obviously, a lot of people don't like that. It wasn't really effective here in Michigan because there were so many ways that you could get out of holding third graders back. And so very few third graders were actually held back. And so the law wasn't really doing what it was intended to do. But I do think that Michigan has to stick with a plan and see it through.
Mm-hmm. Sascha, what would you add?
It does seem that politics is one of the biggest barriers. I mean, Michigan had top 10 in 10 policy not too long ago. It died a very, very quiet death. I'm not even sure what that 10-year mark was anymore. But the ability to really focus politically on a goal and then the kinds of supports that you need to meet that goal, we haven't really seen that in the state. And so I think that, places like Mississippi, Massachusetts, that they were able to kind of find some way to organize around those goals and move forward. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the term is the Michigan 180, where we just keep flipping back and forth between political parties and sort of removing what the others have done. The other thing, I think it's interesting because the third grade reading law was an unfunded mandate. And so if there's no dollars to really help make sure that third grade readers can read, then it's really hard to just have like the stick, The dyslexia bill has passed, though, and that is a funded mandate, which I think could be really interesting if it continues, to make sure that people are being tested to see if they're having issues with reading. I do want to talk about school financing because this is a big, hairy issue in Michigan. So recently, Bridge Michigan Education Watch, you wrote about how last November, voters approved 64.6% of school bond requests. And you also mentioned there was a new report around special education financing, which, full disclosure, Skillman Foundation funds Autism Alliance, which played a really huge role in creating that landmark report. So I'm wondering, Isabel, what is your take on school financing? Do schools have enough money? And if not, then what do we do about revenue?
Yeah, I think it's up to policymakers and parents on if we have enough money, but either way of the coin, whichever side you fall, you can acknowledge that there's issues with it. There's the special education funding. Lori's previously written about school infrastructure and how much money we have of building repairs and different things we need across the state. There is a voter initiative to try to get an increase in taxes on the ballot that would raise income tax for people who are making above $500,000 a year or $1 million a year to help fund schools. So there's all these different points. And then at the core, you talk about school bonds. Like, that's a way that a local school district can really convince their voters that they need more funds, but not every district has the same tax base. Not every district has voters who are willing to fund schools. And you have some districts in the state who have gone to the voters over and over and over again with similar requests, and the voters always turn it down. So then what do you do?
Yeah, I want to stay on school financing, but we're going to move into a break. Lloyd, back to you.
Well, that brings us to an end of this segment, but there's much more ahead with Lori, Isabel, and Sascha, so don't go anywhere. It's Our State of Education, brought to you by the Skillman Foundation on 760 WJR. Welcome back to Our State of Education, proudly supported by the Skillman Foundation, partnering with people to transform education and nurture the brilliance and power of Detroit youth. We're continuing an important conversation with our guest. Angelique, please reintroduce our guest and take us back in.
Thank you, Lloyd. We are talking today with Lori Higgins from Chalkbeat Detroit, Isabel Lohman from Bridge, Michigan, and Sascha Raiyn from WDET. Okay, we left off on the money question. And so, Lori, Sascha, I want you guys to have time to weigh in. Do schools have enough money?
I think what Isabel kind of pointed to with the questions about how money can be used is a really important thing for citizens, whether they're considering bonds or considering who they elect, to know more about that there is funding available to schools and districts, but it may not. It's not as comprehensive. It's not as easy to distribute as you might assume. And so you might get $1 million, but it doesn't help you fix your HVAC system and so those kinds of complexities in funding should be better explained and understood a lot better, I think. So
it's not just more money, it's how money is being used that's really important too.
And the question of who needs money, how much money is needed, whether money is needed or not, those kinds of conversations are important. But there's also policy. There are restrictions on the monies that are made available to schools. And so when money is made available, it'll affect districts differently, schools and school buildings differently. And so then people who are voting to make money available, for example, in some way, or think they are, may not be getting the result that they think they are from their vote, from their requests to their policymakers and politicians.
And what does it take to change those restrictions?
That's a great question. So, some of these things are the actual law. And so I think it takes people being engaged, including politicians being more engaged, and including politicians. I think when we talk to candidates, we often ask them really broad, blanket questions about how they feel about education. I think we need to give them perhaps goals. People need to come with their goals for education.
Interesting. Lori, what would you say?
So I think when we talk about our schools getting enough money, there's always a debate that school districts like Detroit get far more money because they get a lot of federal funding for having a lot of students from low-income homes than, say, a Bloomfield Hills. And so people will say, well, if you look at all that money, like they're making kind of equal, but that money isn't, there are restrictions with that money. It can only go so far. One thing I will note is that, Michigan is moving in a direction where we're trying to fund the students who are the most costly to educate with more funding. So this weighted funding system that, provides students who are at risk with more, or schools more money for students who are at risk. That is probably could be a game changer in Michigan because it means that these schools will be able to provide more resources for those students, will be able to provide more interventions for those students. We aren't at a point where it's fully fully funded yet, but that I think that is one of the critical issues. I've been covering education for a long time, and schools got a flat amount of money for so many years, and you had to spend it however you could. And often the kids who needed the most were not getting what they needed. And now there's this recognition that we need to be able to provide those students who need the most with more funding. So it'd be interesting to see over the years how that plays out here in Michigan.
The Opportunity Index is this weighted funding formula, and it received more funding in this past year from the state budget. It helps kids in rural areas. It helps kids in urban areas. Anyone who needs more gets more. It is pretty revolutionary. And looking at places like Boston, it's really had an impact to help lift student outcomes. So thank you. That's another bright spot, right? That Michigan is doing something differently. We were talking during the break about the dyslexia bill that I mentioned and the nuance that comes with policy. Lori, you had some thoughts about the curriculum piece of the dyslexia bill. You want to touch on that?
Right. So a big piece of the dyslexia legislation was requiring the Michigan Department of Ed to develop a list of approved curriculum, so that part of the issue is that so many districts over the years, and I've covered education for a long time, that I've seen the reading wars shift from whole language back to phonics, then phonics back to something else that sounds like whole language, but there's concern that we've gotten away from phonics too much, and so we want a more balanced reading curriculum. So the state has, I think recently developed this list. But the problem is that school districts aren't required to use a curriculum from this list. They can do whatever they want to do. So there's not, the only incentive to that is, in the most recent budget that passed, there's a provision that parents must be notified if their school district or their kid's school is using a curriculum that is not on this list, and they need to explain to the parents, what their steps are for getting to a better curriculum. But there's still no requirement that they get to a better curriculum.
Yeah.
And I think if we want to see the kind of reading literacy improvement that is needed in Michigan, it seems like, I'm a layperson, but it seems like it would make sense that everyone is using an effective curriculum. And there are some curricula out there that is not well regarded, and schools are using it. So I think that's part of the problem, is that we're such a local control state that politicians in Michigan are very skeptical of forcing anything on schools and wanting them to make their own decisions. But you have to ask yourself, well, what's more important? Is it more important that we see improvement in reading literacy, or is it more important that schools maintain their control? That's a tough one. I mean, the local control issue is a tough one, but because
it's dictating so much of, or diluting so much of what's happening. Here's a pop quiz. And I do pop quizzes in our boardroom all the time. It's super fun. We're an education foundation, so we get to do that. So how many school districts are there in Michigan?
There's roughly 500 traditional districts, close to 250, 300 charters, and then roughly 50 ISDs. Does that sound right?
Yeah, somewhere close to 900 total, like 800, a little over 800.
Mm-hmm. And do you guys know offhand how many school districts there are in Maryland?
I'm guessing it's county system, so it's less?
It's about 24.
Okay.
Wow.
And do you know how many school districts there are in California?
No.
That's gigantic compared to us. About the same that we have, like a little over 900, a little more. So can we actually improve a full system if there are so many districts?
It's a good question.
You guys need to answer this.
Go ahead. I mean, I think it's debatable. I mean, Michigan has a lot of really tiny school districts where, and all these districts are trying to provide the same kind of services to students. There have been efforts at the state level to consolidate school districts, but those don't go anywhere because no one wants to give up their community school district. I mean, you think about a community like Madison Heights, which is pretty small to begin with. They have 2 school districts. I think if you ask voters in that community, should we consolidate and have one district, they would probably say no. And I think that is, and again, we're a local control state. We're not going to force consolidations.
And to your point about the state money, this is like a whole thing where the state's offered money, schools don't take the money, or they study it, and then they say they don't actually want to do it, and then it becomes politically unpopular. And by the time you have to merge when there's financial issues, it's not a sunny experience at all.
Well, a lot of ground has been covered with our guests, but there's still more to unpack. Our final segment right after this break. You're listening to Our State of Education, brought to you by the Skillman Foundation on 760 WJR. Welcome back to Our State of Education, sponsored by the Skillman Foundation, where we follow the will of Detroit youth to dream big and design new possibilities together. Angelique, let's turn it back over to you to reintroduce our guest.
Thanks, Lloyd. So today we're having a really informative and a vigorous conversation with Lori Higgins from Chalkbeat, with Isabel Lohman from Bridge, Michigan, and from Sascha Raiyn from WDET. We were just in some juicy territory as we were talking about how many school districts we have, talking about this issue of local control, talking about the Michigan 180, and sort of changing every time we have a new governor. We haven't talked about even the structure of quote unquote accountability that we have in our state. But that's something else that comes up, is that the state superintendent and the state board, elected state board of education, hires the state sup. Governor is over here, nary the twain shall meet. And so that often gets brought up as something that is a policy shift that can happen. Help us be reporters like you. We are going to hear a lot from the gubernatorial candidates over the next few months, and they all are talking about education. They all have their big education plan. What are the hard-hitting questions we should be asking them?
I think one thing that I would push candidates on is, like, what is the evidence that what you are proposing is or could be effective? I think about, I won't say the candidate's name, but there's a candidate who's proposing, firing principals, firing superintendents. We've been down that road before under No Child Left Behind. I mean, not superintendents, but principals. I don't know how effective that was. And it doesn't address the core issue of what's happening in those communities that lead to students struggling in school. So I do think that we have to hold candidates accountable for not just what they're proposing, but whether or not what they're proposing actually could be effective in Michigan.
It would be nice if we had like a red meat alert, so that when red meat is fed to us, we could sort of say to ourselves, why is it being fed to us? Oh, because firing principals sounds really good, right? Like someone's in charge who's going to take care of it. But have we seen this before, and has it worked? Yeah.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, I think, Lori. And I think it points to just that need for like teachers and specialists, and we need people to join this profession and make schools work. And so that's something that I expect many candidates will have something to say about. But again, how do these proposals you have really affect the issues that we have?
So from recruiting, retaining, how do we look for candidates that'll talk about those types of things? And I don't know if you're saying also at policymaking, having teachers and administrators, or did I add that into what you're saying?
You may have added it, but but I think that is definitely the realm of, a state leader is, like what do we require of policymakers? And that includes, I think, not what kinds of powers should something like the State Board of Ed have, because they don't have the powers that we think they have. So, what kinds of powers should that have? And where can we look for information, for evidence about what our policies ought to be. I think that's an incredibly great point.
Great questions.
And to that, there's the candidate at the front. There's a ton of people in the back room that are telling them things, that's sharing research with them, that's giving them campaign finance, they're giving them donations. So who's advising you? Like, who's in the back room telling you what you're saying your education plan is? And what do those people believe?
That's good. Do you all do like a follow the money story where you talk about who's funding every candidate? Yeah, you guys are nodding.
Yes.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah. Now I'm
When we
pitching
can.
ideas to you of what to write about. So I do want to talk about this field of journalism. We started the conversation hearing about it. I want to close there too in our final segment. Lori, I talked a little bit about media has changed. Can you talk about in the last decade, some of the changes that have happened to your field, and then also what are the best ways that the listener can support local journalism?
I think one of the biggest changes that we're seeing now is the presence of us. There are more nonprofit organizations existing because of what's happening with traditional media. I worked at the Detroit Free Press for almost 19 years. I started in the year 2000. We had 5 education reporters. By the time I left, I was it. We didn't have any other education reporters. That is a challenge for a lot of traditional media where their revenue is not where it used to be, and they don't have the money to have as many education reporters. And education is not necessarily a valued topic for a lot of traditional media. So I think we're seeing a lot more nonprofit media. I think it's a great shift. I think what we're also seeing, which is a good thing, is that there's a lot more collaboration between publications. I spent a lot of years at the Free Press where we hated the Detroit News because we were supposed to, and we wanted to beat them. And it's not like you're going to see the Free Press and the News collaborating on anything, but I do think that, like, for me, it's been a challenge getting used to this idea of sharing resources with other publications. But I think overall the journalism is still in a very precarious position. There's not as much nonprofit funding to go around. Traditional media are competing with us nonprofit media for funding. So I think those are the biggest changes that we've seen. What can people do to help? Like, read us, support us, engage with our work, donate. I don't know if you guys have any ideas, but that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, Isabel, talk about why it matters. Why does local education journalism matter?
Yeah, Lloyd set it up at the top. Your education now, those students are going to become, the citizens, the voters, the workers in the rest of the state, right? But I think it also matters, we are spending a lot of money on these investments, and we want to see these children thrive. So being able to go into the classroom and understand what's happening at that level, I think that's really important.
And Bridge, Michigan, I actually noticed last year these Bridge Education Watch pieces that were coming out. I don't know the cadence where they come out. Can you take us to the newsroom where you all made the decision that this is a really important thing? What was behind that?
Yeah, so we have a twice weekly newsletter called Education Watch. And part of the reason we have newsletters is we want to meet people where they're at. They're already checking their emails. Sometimes it's a shorter version of the story that's on our website. We understand people are busy and we want to meet people where they're at. But I think the flip side of that is because we're a nonprofit, and as Lori mentioned, we like to share, we're able to highlight some of the other reporting across the state that's happening. So instead of duplicating work, we can do different things, and then we can show our readers, hey, here's all these other things you should know about too.
And then with WDET, I'm curious in particular, I know that there were so many changes that have happened with public radio, and that WDET, even despite that, actually rallied, and last year, despite cuts that happened, was able to meet the budget. What are some of the things that you're seeing in public radio that you think people should really be paying attention to?
So it's a really interesting space because what individual public radio and television stations are experiencing depends so much on where they are and what their histories are in their communities and what the resources are in their communities. We've been really, really, really lucky that our listenership has rallied to say that they felt we were an important resource and they wanted to stand up for not just supporting their public radio station, but standing up against the idea that news organizations could be attacked for doing news. And so we've been able to really benefit from that. But there are public radio stations and public television stations in the country and around Michigan who are a lot more vulnerable than we are.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming out today. I feel like I learned a lot from this. And I also want to give a shout out just to reporters and your objectivity. I feel like that's not something that we see in other spaces or on social media. So keep doing what you do, and thank you.
We appreciate you joining us. We'll see you next month with more voices, more insight, and more hope for the future of Michigan students on our State of Education, only on 760 WJR.